The search for meaning in the midst of suffering is a challenge that many of us face at some point in our lives. It's easy to find purpose and meaning when things are going well. But what about when we're in the midst of pain, loss, betrayal, or adversity? That's when the search for meaning becomes more crucial than ever. For Viktor Frankl, man is not defined by what happens to him, but by what he does with what happens to him. This means that, even in the midst of suffering, we have the ability to choose how we react, how we respond, and how we behave. It is at this moment that the search for meaning becomes a conscious choice. But how can we find meaning in the midst of suffering? How can we find meaning in the midst of pain and adversity? One answer may lie in finding a higher purpose for our suffering. This does not mean that suffering itself is desirable or that we should seek to suffer, but rather that if we are suffering, we can use that experience to find a higher purpose. For example, we can use suffering to develop empathy and compassion for others who are also suffering. We can use suffering to learn to appreciate the simple things in life, such as health, family, and friends. We can use suffering to discover our deepest values and most fundamental beliefs. Furthermore, the search for meaning in the midst of suffering can also be an opportunity to question our preconceived beliefs and values. In the midst of suffering, we may discover that our beliefs and values are no longer valid, or that they need to be adapted to our new circumstances. This can be a painful process, but it can also be an opportunity for growth and transformation. Ultimately, the search for meaning in the midst of suffering is a unique and personal journey. Each person has their own story, their own pain, and their own challenges. But no matter what we are facing, we have the ability to choose how we respond and how we find meaning in the midst of suffering. It is this choice that defines who we are as people and determines the kind of life we will live. Few men in history have demonstrated the strength and resilience of Viktor Frankl, an Austrian psychiatrist who survived the horror of the Holocaust. Born in 1905 in Vienna, Austria, Frankl grew up in a Jewish family and showed an early interest in philosophy and psychology. Before World War II, he had already established his career as a psychiatrist and had developed his own theory of logotherapy, which focused on helping people find purpose and meaning in their lives. But in 1942, Frankl's life was abruptly cut short when he and his family were captured by the Gestapo and sent to the Theresienstadt concentration camp. There, he witnessed the brutality and cruelty of the Nazis, who murdered millions of Jews and other undesirables in the name of their racist ideology. However, instead of giving in to despair and hatred, Frankl chose a different path. He began observing the behavior of the prisoners and analyzing how they reacted to the inhumane conditions of the camp. Frankl noticed that even in the midst of horror and misery, there were people who found ways to maintain their dignity and humanity. He saw how prisoners shared what little they had, how they strove to maintain hygiene and cleanliness, and how they helped each other survive. It was at this point that Frankl began to develop his theory of the search for meaning, which would later become the centerpiece of his work, Man's Search for Meaning. In 1944, Frankl and his family were transferred to the Auschwitz concentration camp, where conditions were even more brutal than at Theresienstadt. There, he witnessed the selection of prisoners for the gas chambers, torture, and mass murder. Yet even in the midst of this barbarity, Frankl continued to find ways to maintain hope and purpose. He began giving lectures on psychology and philosophy to fellow prisoners, using his skills as a psychiatrist to help them find meaning in their lives, even in the midst of suffering. When the Auschwitz concentration camp was liberated in January 1945, Frankl was found to be in poor health, weighing only 40 kilograms. However, rather than surrender to his pain and trauma, He chose to channel his experience into helping others. He returned to Vienna and began work on his book, Man's Search for Meaning, which would become an international bestseller and establish him as one of the most important psychiatrists of the 20th century. Have you ever stopped to think about how the choices we make every day impact our lives? How can the decisions we make in response to circumstances that are imposed on us shape who we are and who we can become? For Viktor Frankl, this question was fundamental to his survival in Auschwitz and to the construction of his philosophy. When Frankl was in a concentration camp, one day an older prisoner approached him and asked a question that would change his life forever. What would you do if you were liberated? At first glance, the question may seem simple, almost naive, but in the context of the question, it was revolutionary. It was a question that challenged the passive acceptance of fate and demanded that Frankl take responsibility for his own future. Frankl says that at first, he didn't know what to say. He was so immersed in pain and suffering that he couldn't imagine a different future. But the question kept echoing in his mind, and he began to reflect on what really mattered to him. He realized that even in the midst of this horror, he still had a choice about how to react, how to deal with the situation. He could choose between surrendering to hopelessness or finding a higher purpose. This question changed Frankl's life because it made him understand that freedom is not just a political or geographical condition, but also an inner choice. Even in extreme situations, we always have the option to choose how we will react, how we will deal with what is imposed on us. And it was precisely this understanding that allowed him to find meaning in his life, even in Auschwitz. This question also challenges us to rethink our own choices and priorities. Instead of focusing on the things we cannot control, we can focus on the things we can control, which are our reactions and our choices. We can choose how we will deal with adversity, how we will react to challenges, and it is precisely this choice that defines who we are and who we can become. In short, the question, "What would you do if?" is a question that challenges us to take control of our lives, to find greater meaning in the circumstances imposed on us. It is a question that reminds us that freedom is not just an external condition, but also an internal choice, and that it is this choice that defines who we are and who we can become. Imagine yourself in a situation where you have lost everything: your family, your home, your freedom. You are in a concentration camp, surrounded by cruelty and inhumanity. What is your value as a human being? What is left of you when everything you have built is taken away? This was the reality for Viktor Frankl, an Austrian psychiatrist who spent 3 years in Nazi concentration camps. And it was precisely in this extreme situation that he discovered the power of choice. Amidst the pain, hunger and fear, Frankl realized that there was one thing the Nazis could not take away from him: his ability to choose how to react to circumstances. When you are placed in an extremely difficult situation, it is easy to feel like a victim of circumstances. It is easy to give in to despair and helplessness. But Frankl teaches us that even in the darkest moments, there is always a choice to be made. You can choose how to react to the situation, how to behave in the face of adversity. This choice may seem insignificant at first, but it is precisely this choice that defines who you are as a person. It is the choice between surrendering or rising up, between taking revenge or forgiving yourself, between giving in to fear or finding a way to overcome it. Frankl says that, amidst the suffering in the concentration camps, he found a way to stay alive on the inside. He created a mental game in which he imagined giving a lecture on the psychology of the experience he was going through. This may seem strange, but it was precisely this choice that kept him alive. He chose to focus on something other than the suffering, something that made him feel human again. And that is precisely the choice each of us can make in our own difficult situations. We can choose how we respond to stress, loss, and fear. We can choose to surrender to victimhood or to find a way to overcome our circumstances. It is not an easy choice, it is true, but it is a choice that defines who we are and who we can be. The power of choice in extreme situations is precisely this: the ability to find a way to stay alive inside, even when everything around you seems to be dying. It is the ability to choose how to react, how to behave, how to remain human in the midst of adversity. And it is precisely this choice that makes us who we are. The theory of logotherapy, developed by Viktor Frankl himself, is a revolutionary concept that seeks to find meaning in life, even in the most difficult circumstances. Frankl, a Holocaust survivor, experienced cruelty and inhumanity firsthand, and it was precisely this experience that led him to develop this theory. According to him, logotherapy is a way to find purpose and meaning in life, even when all seems lost. Logotherapy is based on the belief that human beings have an inherent desire to find meaning in their lives. Frankl believed that regardless of circumstances, people have the ability to choose how to respond to situations and find a greater purpose. This means that instead of focusing on how things happened, we should focus on how we can make sense of these experiences. One of the main ideas of logotherapy is that the search for meaning is what motivates us to live. Frankl believed that people are motivated by three things: pleasure, pain, and meaning. While pleasure and pain are ephemeral motivators, meaning is what allows us to find a reason to keep living, even when things get tough. Logotherapy also focuses on the idea that suffering is an inevitable part of life. However, Frankl believed that suffering does not have to be in vain. Instead of focusing on the pain itself, we should focus on how we can find a greater purpose in it. This means that instead of holding on to the pain, we should hold on to the meaning we can find in it. One example of this is Frankl's story in the concentration camp. While there, he noticed that the prisoners who found a greater purpose in their lives, such as helping others or finding spiritual meaning, were the ones who were more likely to survive. This does not mean that their suffering was less, but rather that they found a reason to continue living even in the midst of their terrible situation. Logotherapy also focuses on the importance of attitude. Frankl believed that people have the ability to choose how they react to situations. Instead of focusing on how things happened, we should focus on how we can react to them. This means that we can choose how we make sense of our experiences, even when they are difficult. In short, logotherapy is a theory that seeks to find meaning in life, even in the most difficult circumstances. It is a way to find purpose and meaning, even when all seems lost. By focusing on the search for meaning, accepting suffering, and choosing one's course of action, we can find a reason to keep living, even when things get tough. Attitude towards circumstances is the key to understanding how a man becomes who he is. It is the difference between surrendering to adversity or rising above it. It is the choice between allowing yourself to be consumed by pain or transforming it into an opportunity for growth. Viktor Frankl, in his book Man's Search for Meaning, describes how, amid the inhumane conditions of the Nazi concentration camps, he found a meaning to life. And it was precisely the attitude towards circumstances that made all the difference. When we are faced with obstacles, we have two choices. We can surrender or we can resist. We can let the pain get the better of us, or we can find a way to turn it into something positive. It is our attitude toward these circumstances that defines who we are. If we surrender, we become victims of our circumstances. If we resist, we become their masters, and that is exactly what Frankl did. He did not surrender to the inhumane conditions of the concentration camp. Instead, he found meaning in life, even in the midst of that horrific environment. Our attitude towards circumstances is also a reflection of our choice between resignation and responsibility. When we accept things as they are, without questioning or trying to change them, we are choosing resignation. When we take responsibility for our lives, even in the face of adversity, we are choosing freedom. And this was precisely the choice Frankl made. He did not resign himself to his situation. Instead, he took responsibility for finding meaning in life, even in the midst of the most difficult conditions. Furthermore, our attitude towards circumstances is also a reflection of our ability to find meaning in the midst of suffering. When we suffer, we have two options. We can focus on the pain, or we can find a deeper meaning in it. We can ask ourselves why this is happening to us, or we can ask ourselves what we can learn from this experience. And that is precisely what Frankl did. He did not focus on the pain and suffering. Instead, he found a deeper meaning in life, even in the midst of pain. In short, attitude towards circumstances is the key to understanding how a man becomes what he is. It is the choice between resignation and responsibility, between pain and meaning. It is the choice between surrendering to adversity or rising above it. And it was precisely this choice that Viktor Frankl made, and it made all the difference in his life. When we think about our lives, it's common to feel defined by the circumstances around us. Our work, our family, our friends, our past experiences, all of these seem to shape who we are and how we behave. But Viktor Frankl, one of the greatest psychologists of the 20th century, reminds us that this isn't true. According to him, man is more than his circumstances. This statement may seem simple, but it's revolutionary in its simplicity. Think of someone you know who has been through a traumatic experience, such as the loss of a loved one or a serious illness. It's common for these people to be defined by their experience, as if it shaped who they are. But Frankl tells us that this isn't true. A person is more than the experience they've been through. They are more than their pain, more than their suffering. They are more than the circumstances that surround them. This doesn't mean that circumstances don't have an impact on our lives. Of course they do. They can shape us, they can influence us, they can challenge us, but they don't define us. We are more than our circumstances because we have the ability to choose how we respond to them. We have the ability to choose how we behave in response to the things that happen to us. And it's that choice that defines who we are, not the circumstances themselves. One example of this is the story of Malala Yousafzai, the young Pakistani woman who was shot by the Taliban for speaking out for women's right to education. She could have become a victim. She could have allowed herself to be defined by her traumatic experience, but she chose not to be. She chose to continue fighting for what she believed in, even in the midst of pain and suffering. And it was this choice that made her who she is today, an international leader, a defender of human rights, an inspiration to millions of people around the world. This is the lesson Frankl teaches us. Man is more than his circumstances. We are more than our experiences, more than our losses, more than our mistakes. We are more than the things that happen to us. We are the choices we make in response to the things that happen to us. And it is this choice that defines who we are, not the circumstances themselves. The freedom to choose one's own attitude is a revolutionary concept that Viktor Frankl presents to us in his work. It is the ability to choose how we react to difficult situations, even when we cannot control the events around us. Frankl learned this lesson firsthand during his experience in the Nazi concentration camps, where he was subjected to inhumane conditions and lost many loved ones. However, instead of giving in to despair and bitterness, he chose to use his experience to find purpose and meaning. This choice is not easy, because our natural reactions to difficult situations are often driven by fear, anger, or self-pity. However, it is precisely in these moments that we have the opportunity to exercise our freedom to choose. We can choose to either surrender to our lower nature or rise above it, transforming our experiences into opportunities for growth and learning. Frankl teaches us that even when we cannot change our circumstances, we can change the way we experience them. One of the reasons this choice is so difficult is that our minds are wired to react automatically to negative stimuli. This is a defense mechanism that evolved to protect us from harm, but it can also trap us in negative patterns of thinking and behaving. However, when we realize that we have a choice, we can begin to question our automatic reactions and choose more constructive responses. This doesn't mean it's easy, but it does mean it's possible. The freedom to choose our own attitude also allows us to find purpose and meaning in difficult situations. When we choose how we respond, we can transform negative experiences into opportunities for growth and learning. This does not mean that bad things stop being bad, but rather that we can find greater meaning in the midst of suffering. Frankl teaches us that suffering is not something to be avoided at all costs, but rather something that can be transformed into an opportunity for growth and for finding our deepest selves. This choice also has a profound effect on our relationships with others. When we choose how we respond, we can break the negative patterns of behavior that may be affecting our relationships. We can choose to respond with anger and resentment, or with compassion and empathy. This doesn't mean that others will change, but it does mean that we can change the way we interact with them. And it is precisely this choice that can transform our relationships and create a more positive and constructive environment. In short, the freedom to choose one's attitude is a powerful tool for personal and relational transformation. It is the ability to choose how we respond to difficult situations, even when we cannot control the events around us. It is the choice between giving in to despair and bitterness, or using our experiences to find purpose and meaning. It is the choice between responding with anger and resentment, or with compassion and empathy. And it is this choice that can transform our lives and our relationships. Amidst the horror and dehumanization of the Auschwitz concentration camp, Viktor Frankl found purpose. While many have lost hope, he found deeper meaning in that horrific experience. Rather than surrender to the pain and suffering, Frankl chose to find greater meaning in the midst of his reality. He recounts in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, that while being transported to Auschwitz, he had written a manuscript on psychotherapy, which represented years of study and work. However, upon arriving at the camp, the Nazi guards took it from him and threw it away. Frankl reports that at first he felt intense pain at the loss of his work, but he soon realized that it was just a material object and that the true value lay in the idea itself. He began to rewrite the manuscript in his head, remembering every word and every sentence. This experience was a turning point for Frankl. He understood that even in the most adverse conditions, human beings have the ability to find purpose. He could not change his circumstances, but he could choose how to respond to them. While the prisoners around him despaired, Frankl found a reason to continue living. He began to help other prisoners, sharing his experience and wisdom to keep hope alive. At Auschwitz, Frankl also observed that prisoners who found a purpose beyond their own survival were the ones most likely to endure the horrific conditions of the camp. They found a reason to live, whether by helping others or by finding meaning in their own experience. Frankl realized that even in this place of horror, there was an opportunity to find deeper meaning, and it was this discovery that helped him survive and find a greater purpose in life. Frankl's experience in Auschwitz is a powerful example of how human beings can find meaning in pain. Instead of giving in to despair, He chose to find a higher purpose. It was this choice that led him to develop logotherapy, a therapy that focuses on finding meaning in life. Frankl proved that even in the most difficult conditions, it is possible to find purpose and deeper meaning. And this is a lesson that can inspire and motivate anyone to find meaning in their own life. When we think of suffering, we tend to associate it with pain, loss, and hopelessness. However, Viktor Frankl teaches us that suffering can be transformed into growth, and this is a valuable lesson for everyday life. It is easy to give in to difficult circumstances and feel like a victim of the situations around us. But as Frankl shows us, it is precisely in these moments that we have the opportunity to choose how we respond. When we suffer, we can choose between two paths: bitterness and growth. Bitterness leads us into a spiral of negativity, where we feel wronged and victimized. Growth, on the other hand, allows us to transform suffering into an opportunity for learning and self-reflection. This does not mean that suffering is easy to overcome, but rather that we can find deeper meaning in the midst of pain. One of the main challenges we face when we suffer is the loss of control. We feel that things are happening to us and no longer by our choice. However, it is precisely in these moments that we can exercise our most fundamental freedom, the freedom to choose how we react. We can choose how we respond to suffering, and it is this choice that defines who we are as human beings. Transforming suffering into growth is not an easy process, and it requires courage and determination. We must be willing to face the pain and explore the reasons that lead us to suffer. We must be willing to question and challenge ourselves to find a deeper meaning in the pain. And it is precisely in this process of self-reflection that we can find the opportunity for growth. One example of this is the story of Malala Yousafzai, who was shot by terrorists in 2012. Instead of giving in to bitterness and hatred, Malala chose to turn her suffering into a platform to advocate for girls' right to education. She could have become a victim, but she chose to become a leader and an inspiration to millions of people around the world. Frankl's lesson for everyday life is clear. Suffering is not something that happens to us, but rather something we can transform into growth. It is a choice we must make every day, in every difficult moment we face. And it is precisely in this choice that we find the opportunity to become who we are truly capable of being. And then, faced with the abyss of suffering, Viktor Frankl found the answer that would forever change the way we see the world. Man is not what happens to him, but what he does with what happens to him. It is the choices we make in the midst of chaos that define who we are. It is the attitude we adopt in the face of circumstances that makes us grow or lets us succumb. It is the freedom to choose how we respond to suffering that makes us human. In Auschwitz, Frankl found meaning in pain, and amid the ashes of the Holocaust, logotherapy was born, a theory that reminds us that life is more than the circumstances that surround us. It is more than what has been done to us. It is what we do with what has been done to us that makes us who we are. And this is the lesson that Viktor Frankl leaves us, that suffering is not the end, but the beginning. That pain is not an obstacle, but an opportunity. That the choices we make in the midst of chaos are what make us grow, make us mature, and make us find meaning in life. So when the next challenge comes, the next pain, the next adversity, remember you have a choice. You have the power to choose how you will respond. You have the power to turn suffering into growth. And it is that choice that will make you the man you are, the man you choose to be. Now that you've discovered how Viktor Frankl inspires us to find meaning even in the most difficult moments, it's time to reflect on how you're choosing to deal with adversity in your own life. Leave a comment below about how you're turning your challenges into opportunities for growth. And if you were inspired by this message, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring and thought-provoking content. And if you're ready for more, click the link in the description below to watch our next video, where we explore title of next video. Thanks for watching, and remember, you are what you make of what's been done to you.